folks that don't know me, my name is Ryan Pankau. I'm the horticulture educator out of Champaign, kind of right smack dab in the middle of the state. And I'm here today to talk to you about some pruning practices that I'm hoping you can apply to trees in your community, at your home, in places that you see any young shade trees. My background is as a forester and an arborist, so I've worked just my entire career with something tree related. And pruning is just one of my favorite topics. It's something I've been doing since I was, first started a professional career. So why do we prune? What are the reasons why we'd want to prune a tree? Well, I would argue it's one of the most important cultural practices we do in the landscape because it impacts our highest value plants, our trees and our shrubs. They're very long-lived and they're probably the most valuable plants in the landscape. Some of them take a human lifetime to establish. Keeps those plants healthy and vigorous and attractive. And I'm going to go through all the reasons why it kind of helps with structural weaknesses and some of these other risks. But first off, I also want to point out a lot of young trees in an urban landscape, and by urban, I don't necessarily mean downtown Chicago. I'm talking some of these places like you see here in a built landscape. They're under in a high stress situation. They have transplant shock playing in on all the other things that we as humans throw at them, from this really super disturbed roadside planting here with very little mulch or anything to retain moisture, right next to a bus route. So there's cars whizzing by these trees you see in an urban setting, and just a lot of stress that we put on them. And we know from some of the research that a lot of these trees in an urban setting have a relatively shorter lifespan at times. And so a lot of these studies were done focused on trees in the boulevard, like I showed on the last picture, where the boulevard would be that area kind of between the sidewalk and the street. But my middle bullet point there, that study actually looked at trees in different settings. So the more natural of a setting we get, I think, is what this kind of tells me, the more of a lifetime we can expect for these trees. So one of the big factors, though, in long-term survival of these plants as they get larger and mature, is having a sound canopy structure. And so there's a lot of things we can do with pruning to avoid a breakout like you see on the sugar maple in the picture. One question I get from folks a lot is, why do I need to prune the trees in my yard? Trees in a forest don't need pruning. They get along just fine without pruning happening for all of eternity. They've done that, in forest settings. Well, the explanation for that is that trees evolved to grow under competition, and really tough competition. Whether it's in the forest understory or the overstory, they're competing with plants around them, and that creates a different canopy structure than we see with open grown trees that are in our kind of urban areas most times. So this is a blown up picture of that last slide of an upland oak stand in Southern Illinois, and you can tell these are pretty tall, skinny trees, relatively small side limbs. If I flip to this picture from Central Kentucky, this is where some of our southern pines start to mix into a forest stand. And you see a similar thing, relatively tall trees, skinny side limbs, just that kind of forest tree canopy structure. To flip to Central Illinois, this is a planted pine stand of non-native pine in Central Illinois, but I think we can all picture these really tall stands of pine trees from out west or any place else you've seen them planted. And so all the sites we've looked at up to this point are kind of upland sites, on kind of the top of a hill, or in a drier site where, what do we see when we get to the bottomlands? This is also a scene from Piatt County in Central Illinois, where I live, of the Sangamon River bottoms. And even in a bottomland setting where there's more moisture available, maybe better soils, we see a similar development in this forest structure. Tall trees, not a lot of side limbs. Go to a younger stand on the Sangamon River as well in Piatt County, and pretty similar structure with these younger trees. And this is just one of my favorite pictures I've ever taken of trees. And at the time I took it, I didn't realize that it would be as neat to me as it is. But if you look out into the distance on this tree, on this picture, all you see is tree stems. And this is an example of a young forest stand going through the stem exclusion phase. And that's where all these trees compete so heavily. Some just simply die out from lack of resources, whether it's water or light. This is also a bottomland setting along the Sangamon, and just about every stem you see in this picture is silver maple. This is an area that was farmed, was in a agricultural type setting, and was replanted to trees about probably 20 years before this picture or so. I'm not sure the exact history, but it was planted into a mixture of trees, oaks and other things, because I can find some of those little oak trees still hidden in here. But these silver maples just absolutely took over and have dominated the site, and they're going to be the dominant land cover for years to come once they sort out which plants are going to be in the overstory. Now, we've seen some pictures of trees in a natural setting to kind of give you a picture of what that looks like. Now let's flip to a more park-like setting. This is Hessel Park in Champaign-Urbana. And notice we see a lot different of a canopy structure. We don't have as tall, straight, skinny as stems. We have lots of large codominant stems. We have limbs really far down on the trunk, like in this tree in the right-hand side of the picture. And to go to one more picture of an open-grown oak tree, this is from Carbondale, Illinois, in Turley Park, kind of in the center of town. This is a much different form than if you think back to that first picture of an oak stand, also in southern Illinois, kind of close to here. This tree looks a lot different than what we see in a forest. And last tree to kind of visualize here, this is really a pretty common urban tree, this honey locust from kind of the northern area of Champaign. This is right outside the soil testing lab. I take all of our soil samples, and I've seen that tree so many times I finally took a picture, but what we see is a lot of large stems coming out of the trunk very low down, and that's a lot different than this kind of natural forest setting that trees evolved to be in. So one of the major factors at play in all of this is what we refer to as aspect ratio, and that refers to the diameter of the trunk that we're looking at compared to the limb next to it. So if we look at the picture at the left here, where we have a 2-to-1 ratio between this larger trunk and smaller trunk, that's a large ratio, and that's a weaker branch attachment right here than we see at the right, where we have more like a 5-to-2 ratio. This is a much stronger branch attachment where we have large trunk, skinnier side limb. So that's something that we'll be thinking about in all this pruning talk today. But another thing that comes into play is just the method by which trees grow. And whether you realize this or not, primary growth in a woody plant comes from the tips, from this apical or terminal bud. And that's where growth starts in the springtime. And when that's initiated here, this bud sends a plant hormone called auxin back down the stem to suppress the other side buds or side limbs and say, hey, I'm up here, I'm growing towards the sunlight. All the rest of you below me need to slow down a little bit so I can get taller faster. That's the main goal with a tree and the way their canopy structure develops, to get tallest the fastest and capture more sunlight and resources for themselves compared to a competitor tree. There's also secondary growth in trees, and for this, think of tree rings. That's the growth that occurs kind of at this cambium layer and enlarges the trunk. So that happens actually at a different time, just a little bit after primary growth, first thing in the spring. So that's that growth that kind of makes trunks larger and gives us, tree rings that we can count. So let's look at a little closer at branch attachments, because, and I love this chunk of wood from a firewood splitting pile here, where you can really see a limb in its attachment point. And this was actually a dead limb at the time that this was split. I know because it's such a dark color and because the tree started to kind of grow around it right here. But a branch union like this has kind of an overlapping pattern of wood fiber that creates the strength in the branch union. And that happens first when primary growth begins in the limb. And that's what I'm trying to circle right here, is if you can imagine this limb in the springtime, primary growth starts in the buds, and that limb starts to enlarge a little bit. As the spring progresses later in the year, secondary growth happens. And remember, that's kind of our trunk expansion or expansion of the growth rings of the tree, and starts to create this kind of overlapping pattern in the branch union that makes it especially strong. So when we look at branches with this large aspect ratio, where it's like 1-to-1 in this picture of this crabapple, that's a pretty weak attachment because of those codominant stems right next to each other. In this case, there's not as much influence from primary growth, but mostly secondary growth at play in this branch union, where really those tree rings start to butt up against each other, if you want to think about it that way. And they create an area right here that can be more prone to separation from other branch unions. So that's not as strong of a branch union as if we had a smaller limb to the side here, as opposed to a 1-to-1 attachment. And you can see this kind of weaker aspect of certain branch limbs when you look at a U-shaped branch attachment like this with a wide crotch angle versus a V-shaped branch attachment that's pretty narrow like this. So we get what we actually refer to as included bark right here in the branch union that gets trapped in there, starts to cause a little bit of rot, and can make this limb more prone to failure. So when we're pruning, we're trying to remove those V-shaped branch unions and focus growth or favor the U-shaped branch unions. That's just a really basic principle. So to kind of review what we've talked to up to this point, open grown trees in more of an urban setting like this red maple you see here tend to have clusters of limbs down low with large aspect ratios. And that's what you really see here. If I blow up those branch unions, look at that. There's a lot of those limbs are close to the size of the trunk, and they're stacked up right on top of each other right there. And they create some just not only weaker branch attachments at times, but just some instability in the trunk. There's not a straight grain of wood right there. It's all kind of curving around those branch angles or branch attachments. And so with pruning, we can start to eliminate some of these problems by focusing on this when a tree is very young. So the younger we can start to prune a tree, the more we can have some corrective actions to stop some of this development. So let's flip back to our branch attachment. I want to remind you of this kind of picture in your mind of kind of this branch attachment point. And let's focus some discussion on the branch collar area. And on this pine tree, you can really see that the branch collar tissue well. This is it's an area where kind of those overlapping sections of wood overlap right there, creating the strength, but it's also an area that's ready to react when we make a pruning cut. So it's very important that we align our pruning cut correctly with the branch collar to make the best cut and have the tree be able to grow around that the best. So we say that tree pruning cuts don't heal because they don't regenerate tissue like we do, but they seal. So if we look at this cut, this is a freshly made cut where you can really see the branch collar was left here. This is a well done cut on a red oak versus this red maple pruning cut that was made a couple years prior to this picture. And in a few slides here, I'll show you what it looks like when this wound grows, seals over. But what the tree's doing is putting on essentially secondary growth right here to kind of grow over, to create callus tissues, what we often call this, to grow over that wound. And lastly, at the right here is a cut that I made on a sugar maple at my house. And you can see I inadvertently cut into the branch collar a little bit here. This is probably about the size of a basketball. It was a large cut that I made with a chainsaw. And since there's more growth right here, you can see there's a little bit less on this side. And that's where I've kind of removed a little bit of this collar tissue. And so that tissue is there and it's ready to react. When we remove the limb, it reacts to kind of grow over that area and seal out rot and decay. And that's the big thing that we're focused on in tree pruning, is stopping the spread of rot and decay. And this is what you see here is a model at the right of how rot and decay spread up and down a tree trunk. And you could go into a whole presentation on how this rot and decay is compartmentalized within a tree. But there's different barrier walls that limit the development of rot in the tree trunk. And the walls that limit this spread up and down the trunk are weaker than the walls that limit the spread outward and across the trunk. And that's just the way trees have evolved and developed over the millennia. And I think we all can think of an example of a tree that's very hollow up the center, but it's still standing. And that's because the barrier wall that allowed rot to spread up and down broke down, but the outer wall that keeps it from spreading out of this heartwood area. So that's this kind of dead, darker inner area of the trunk that's mostly for support. It's not living tissue, versus the sapwood, which is around the outer edge, that is living and is ready to react and form some of this reaction wood. So that's a main point of pruning cuts, is to try and have them do what you see here, where by year 3, this cut on this red maple has completely sealed shut, and that's trapped out any more rot and decay. There's probably a little bit of rot starting to develop right there, but in this case, it's sealed it out and it's kind of stopped that process. If we take a look at this tulip poplar stem right here, this is a dead limb that probably broke off in a storm, and there's a little bitty stub left right here, but you can see the callus tissue starting to form around this. And what's going to have to happen here is this callus tissue is going to have to grow all the way out and around this stub and encase it. So in this case, if we could cut off this stub, we'd allow that callus tissue to close faster. And that's essentially what we're kind of doing with the pruning cut, is removing that area outside the branch collar so that callus tissue can quickly form. The picture at the right is a picture of a white oak from the parking lot of Bell Smith Springs Natural Area down in the Shawnee National Forest. I would suspect this is the result of storm damage, but look at all of those branch stubs on the trunk that this tree has miraculously grown around it, encased in its trunk wood. And think about all the extra energy this plant expended to do that, but it's just an amazing picture of how this process kind of works. And even if you leave those stubs in place, the plant's going to try and grow over them, but it's going to take a lot of energy in the process. So this is just another kind of diagram from our Master Gardener manual that shows, this branch collar tissue and removing this, essentially this stub, or if you want to envision this as a limb that goes all the way out. We're going to make our cut there and leave the branch collar intact. Here's a picture of a crabapple that kind of shows that branch collar nicely here. You can see that kind of taper area that tapers out to a more narrow point, and that's about where we would make our cut on this crabapple, to kind of remove the limb but leave the branch collar tissue in place. If we take a look at a larger example of this green ash tree, it's a little harder to see the branch collar tissue right here, but it's present. We know it's present at every branch union. And this is about where the proper cut would be made, just outside that branch collar. But a lot of folks have a tendency to make an incorrect flush cut that's a little more flush with the trunk, as opposed to this cut that's left some material right here. It's not natural to leave this kind of extra material in the branch collar. Most folks kind of like to make this cut. This was actually made on an ash tree that I was removing at my home because it died of emerald ash borer. So I was able to make a correct cut and then an incorrect cut. It didn't matter, the tree was dead, so it didn't hurt a tree in taking this picture. And so once again, just an example of kind of a good pruning cut there and how they develop. So if we don't have the opportunity, if we don't have a really visible branch collar, sometimes with codominant stems, this is going back to my kind of 1-to-1 aspect ratio picture. It's not easy to identify that branch collar, so it's hard to see here. So here's a really easy way we can do that. It starts by identifying the branch bark ridge, which is this kind of wrinkly bit of bark right here that happens between every branch union, big or small. You can find this this feature on branch connections. So we're going to imagine a line that is 90 degrees to that, and then we're going to bisect that line along a 45-degree angle, and that's the location where our cut should be. So over the years, as I've trained people on my tree pruning crews, I worked as a commercial arborist for years. As I've taught others now at Extension to make pruning cuts, this really helps folks to create the 90-degree angle and then think about bisecting it. But as you get a little bit better, as you practice this cut, in my mind, it really works more like a 45-degree angle off this branch bark ridge. And so that's essentially what we're doing. And we know that this is the best estimate we can get as to where that collar tissue lies in this branch union, because it's not easily identifiable or seeable. And so that's the way we kind of, and also on every branch union, you can find this branch bark ridge. In this case, I chose a very straight up, very symmetrical branch union, but as that branch union starts to maybe lean at a different angle or have a different slant to it, you can still find this branch bark ridge, and you're keying off the angle of the branch bark ridge towards the angle of the limb you're removing to make this 45-degree estimate. So even if that's a little off center or leaning, you can always still use the branch bark ridge as kind of your reference point to estimate where that collar tissue and where your correct cut would be. All right, so now let's start talking about some of the fundamentals of pruning, and these are just some of the basics that I cover with folks first. First, you need to identify the species. Genus may be okay, but you need to understand the needs of the plant, and that's why I've shown crabapple trees in this picture, because notice I've just put Malus species. I don't necessarily know the species of these crabapples, but I'm going to prune most crabapples about the same. So sometimes genus is okay, but if you know down a species, you can better understand that tree's needs. Same thing with hydrangea. it's kind of the opposite with hydrangeas, and those are usually shrubs, not trees. But with hydrangeas, we really do need to know down to species, because there's difference in how those flower buds are put on the plant, and we need to know which species of hydrangea we have. But another good point is just to assess the whole plant before making any cuts. And this photo of a Japanese tree lilac here at our extension building, I took with the corner of the building kind of lined up with the tree trunk. And if you look at this left-hand side of the canopy, that's pretty thin. And if we walked up only looking at the plant from this side and started to prune, that's going to get really unbalanced and thin compared to this other side of the canopy. So take a look at all sides. And even during pruning, I'm stepping back and kind of looking at all different angles of the plant to make sure I'm not missing something or I'm not creating an imbalance. And that some of this is more for visual and ornamental appeal, but also for creating a balanced canopy. Finally, never make a cut without a good reason. And I'm going to talk at the end of this presentation about pruning objectives and how we kind of assign and prioritize those. But you should always have a good reason for each pruning cut, and it should be following some objectives that you're trying to create for that tree and for the long-term health of the canopy. So one big question also with pruning is, how much can you prune? And recommendations on how much you can prune, or the pruning dose, are ever changing with science. And so I say in the old days, meaning, you know, back in the early 2000s, late 90s, when I was a young arborist, kind of being taught this by others, we actually said that it was pretty permissible to do about a third of the foliage, remove that in one pruning session, versus nowadays that's been dialed back a little bit to a quarter of the foliage. But on the next slide, I'll even talk about how that's been dialed back more, or refined over time. So we're kind of understanding more about how to apply this dose, what's the healthy amount for a plant. And when I say 1/4 of the foliage, you could also view that as 1/4 of the limbs, but really I'm most concerned about 1/4 of the leaf area. So the amount of leaf area that's producing energy for the plant is where I'm looking at that 1/4 of that 1/3 of that amount. So nowadays, and I think this was in 2023, our pruning standards, the ANSI A300 pruning standards for the tree care industry, are our science-based standards that most folks follow. It's not, there's no absolute law or requirement that you have to follow these, but these are the guidelines that most tree businesses operate within. And if you notice, those pruning standards were changed to say, we're not going to prune off any more living material than what's necessary. And we're going to assess all these factors before we determine what's necessary. So I still find the 1/4 rule as kind of a good estimate, or a way to think about this or start to picture this if you don't have much pruning experience. But what this new standard is telling me is that there's a lot more that comes into play than just the total amount of foliage we're taking off. We need to consider all aspects of this plant with its respect to its age, its size, the conditions it's in. And so one of the first most basic things I'm doing before I start to prune any plant is assessing its health. And so I want to look at this plant and make sure that it's in good health and it can handle that dose of pruning. And if I don't think it is, I'm going to be shrinking that pruning dose down much smaller. And so while arborists have just a ton of things that they will take into consideration on a plant in assessing their health, there is a lot that goes into this. There are some very basic things that we can look at that are pretty intuitive. So first off, that's canopy size and extent. Do I have a full canopy? Is it full of leaves, or do I have some dead spots? That's a pretty easy one to determination to make. And if you have some gaps or holes in the canopy or dead spots, that's obviously a time that we'd think about dialing in our pruning dose a little better. If leaves are on the plant and you're able to look at and assess leaves, are those leaves a full and healthy size for that species? Are they an appropriate color? And you know, one of the trees that tricks us sometimes on color is catalpa, which has a very yellowish colored leaf. So don't be fooled by catalpa, but you do have to know a little bit about, you know, the average size and color of a leaf for this plant. And if you don't know that, pick up a guidebook. There's really good descriptions in plant ID, tree ID guidebooks. There's a ton available out there that will really tell you a detailed description of how big that leaf should be, and even a lot of times some description of the color. But in the wintertime, we're not able to look at all these factors very easily. So annual twig growth is something that I look at year-round to kind of assess health, and it is really just a great snapshot that you can pick up in an instant. And so the way we can tell annual twig growth is by looking at this terminal bud scale scar. So on this sugar maple twig, this is where the terminal bud was last year, and then over the course of this year, this twig grew out of it. As this bud starts to grow and develop in the springtime, it leaves this little wrinkly bit of bark in this circular bud scale scar. Here you can see another one where this bud grew into a twig as well. If I blow this up a little bit, you can see here I like to use sugar maple for this example because this twig is very different color this first year twig versus the second year, but I can even trace back to the last bud scale scar, and I think I counted almost 4 to 5 years of growth on this one limb that I could trace back. How this helps us assess health is that if you know how far, how much growth a sugar maple should have per year, you can look at this and say, yeah, that's a pretty good amount of growth. This tree's fairly healthy. But even if you don't know that, and you can find a couple years worth of terminal bud scale scars, you can assess the trend. And I'd say in this case, this is pretty even growth from last year to this year. It's grown about the same amount, but what I don't want to see is a diminishing twig length. If it's getting shorter each year, that's telling me this plant's under stress. So this is yet another way we can assess tree health. On some plants, the terminal bud scale scar is easy to see. On others, like if I think about a bur oak that has corky twigs and not very thin bark on its twigs, this may be a little harder to see, but if you can pick this out and start to see it, it can help you get a pretty good picture of tree health. All right, so let's move on to talk. We've talked about some of the aspects of branch attachments and why they're strong or weak. We've talked about how to make one single pruning cut, but now let's talk about how you apply pruning cuts across a canopy to kind of meet some objectives. So this is a list of, for a young shade tree, really the common objectives that I would have in order of priority right here. So with any pruning operation, we're going to first remove dead, dying, and diseased limbs. So any dead limbs need to come out, any diseased or damaged limbs, we're going to take some of those out first. The next factor here that's the second most important is establishing a central leader. And you can see on this tree, there's not a very good central leader. The central leader of the plant would be defined as this uppermost growing point. And if you think about a pine tree that's really pyramidal in shape, it has a really defined central leader most times. That's what builds the best tree canopy structure. That's how those canopies develop under competition and pressure. They have to have a strong central leader. Next, we're going to look at establishing scaffolding limbs. So that's the permanent side limbs for the plant. And you really need to think long-term in this case. With this plant, some of these lower limbs are really in conflict with some of the vehicles you see parked here, and they may not be permanent limbs for the rest of this tree's life. So you need to think about, what are those permanent scaffolding branches? Should I remove some things now to make way for those scaffolding limbs? And I put some guidelines here. With trees less than 5 years old, maybe 6 to 12 inches in spacing. As they get to be 5 years old and on, 20 to 24 inch spacing. But again, this is kind of a guideline to help you picture that spacing. As all of us know, nature is never symmetrical and perfect. And if you're trying to prune all your plants to get that exact spacing, you're going to drive yourself crazy. So don't get obsessed with this, but it's helping you kind of picture up and down the stem, how far out should those permanent scaffolding limbs be spaced. And what we want to avoid long-term is just this giant cluster of limbs down low in one place. We know that's much weaker than these limbs kind of spread out. Second to last is ground clearance as an objective, and that's just simply clearance for cars, clearance for people to move around. We generally need those trees or those plants to be up enough that we can move around. And lastly, the last thing I would consider is duplicating or crossing branches. So duplicating limbs are kind of growing to the same place. Crossing limbs are crossing each other. And if you want to think about it in other terms folks use for pruning, that's kind of some thinning of the canopy. And so how I would apply these pruning objectives is to start with number one. And this is the best way I've trained folks that are new at this, to start with number one and slowly move down the list, accomplishing each objective or addressing it until you've reached your pruning dose. So until you've reached about 1/4 of that canopy or whatever you've decided is kind of that right pruning dose, and then you stop once you've reached that level. And so I like to keep these pruning objectives up but show you some pictures of real young trees. And these are all from around Central Illinois. And we'll talk about how to kind of apply these objectives and where the cuts would be. Now, I know it's a little bit hard to see every last little twig on this, so I'm going to try and blow up some of the spots of the plants that we're looking at. And so if I look at this tree right off the bat, it does have somewhat of a central leader up there at the top. And I'll blow this up a little bit. But what I do see are a couple of what I would call probably water sprouts, or really fast growing sprouts from a dormant bud right here and right here that were kind of stimulated to grow from the extra sunlight that this plant's getting. It's pretty much open sun. And so what may happen over time is both of these are kind of fast growing sprouts with probably a weak branch attachment. We can kind of assume that. They may start to compete with our central leader. So the first thing I would recommend is to accomplish this kind of objective of opening up our central leader is to make a couple little snips right there. I guess another thing I'll point out on each one of these slides, my slides are going to look similar as we're looking at tree canopies, but I do have a little bit of history with most of these plants that I've looked at. So I know that this is a northern red oak that's about 3 years post-planting. So it's been in the ground long enough that it's kind of recovered from transplant shock and some of that stress. And now's the time where I'm starting to look at pruning this. So for very newly planted trees, probably want to back off a very heavy pruning and let them kind of recover from transplant shock for a little bit. But another cut that I think I would like to make is addressing this kind of multi-trunk area right here where we have 3 stems. And I'd like to go out here and make a pruning cut to kind of reduce a little bit of pressure from this side limb on our central leader. So I'm going to reduce this stem a little bit to allow our central leader to kind of keep growing out of this. So at this point, we've made a couple cuts up here, just one right here. And now I'd like to make a few cuts to help set up some of our permanent scaffolding branches. So I'm suggesting probably both of these would go at the trunk. We'd take off both of these side limbs. They aren't going to be permanent scaffolding limbs. They're probably about 4 feet off the ground, and they're interfering with mowing and other operations that have to happen around this plant. Notice I'm not suggesting we remove these smaller little sprouts right here. And when some of these limbs lower down on the trunk are relatively small and not in the way yet, I like to leave those smaller stems. And I used to be the person that would clean off all of this trunk. But we know now that those side limbs are kind of feeding in a little bit of sugars from the leaves. And that's how trees produce their energy, is they produce sugars in their leaves from photosynthesis. And that's helping with that trunk enlargement right there, that little bit of sugar input from these side limbs. So while I am going to prune off the larger ones that are becoming a problem in developing, a larger diameter right here when I make the cut, that's something to think about too, is fewer cuts that are smaller diameter are better than, or more cuts that are smaller diameter are better than fewer cuts that are larger diameter. And that just has to do with that wound closure. So anyway, lastly, if I have a little bit left in my pruning, if I think I'm still less than 1/4 of the canopy, or whatever I've assigned as kind of my dose, I would maybe do a few cuts to kind of eliminate duplicating and crossing branches. And notice I've added a circle down here for this little sprout that's really growing straight up aggressively. I'm going to go ahead and prune that off because, like these couple sprouts up here, I feel like those really vertical, straight growing sprouts are weakly attached and they're growing quickly, and I don't want those to overcome other areas of the canopy that I'd like to keep. And as you can see, there's probably going to be a pretty narrow branch attachment union right there. That's going to be one of those V-shaped branch unions, and I'd like to just prune that out today. Okay, then this is a white oak tree that was planted in fall of 2024, so it had all of 2025 to grow. I would try and consider its health and think about if this plant's still in a state of shock and how well it's done. And remember, last summer was a huge drought across really all of Illinois, definitely central Illinois. And this plant put on a nice little tuft of growth right here from when it was planted. This was the terminal bud, and all of these twigs grew out of that over last summer during a drought year. So that tells me this plant's in pretty good health. And so I am concerned that I have a lot of growth in kind of a cluster right here. And so I'm going to recommend that we prune for the purpose of establishing this nice central leader right here and keeping it free of competition. I would probably clip off just a couple of these side limbs, but I'm not going to prune this very heavily because it was just planted. I am going to make a few corrective cuts right now, though, to kind of correct that. All right, now let's look at a little bit larger of a tree that has a little bit more canopy structure. You can see a lot of growth going on here. This is a white oak that is really well established. It's 5 years post-planting. I've assessed its twig growth, and it's phenomenal. It's really doing a good job. It's bounced back. We had a big cicada hatch a few years ago. I've examined its twigs, and I can see some of those cicada wounds, but they're sealing over nicely. The plant's growing out of that. And so I'm saying it's full on time to prune this, and we can really give it, pretty good pruning to correct some of the problems we see. And so one of those I've just put a circle around is, again, a cluster of stems low down on the trunk. And to help visualize this, as we look at where I'm going to recommend some of the cuts, I put a line on, each corresponding stem here. If we look at this up close, we've got a pretty narrow branch union between the green and the yellow stem. And so I'd like to address that. I'm calling this yellow stem the central leader. And I know with the way this picture is taken, this limb, the blue stem maybe looks a little bigger, but you have to keep in mind we're looking at, that's perspective, and that blue stem is closer to us. It's coming out right at us. And so from inspecting it up close, I know I want to probably favor this yellow stem as the central leader or the central part of the branch. So now to zoom in a little bit more, get a closer picture. I've kind of illustrated the central leader by following this yellow arrow straight up. That's really the growth I'm trying to promote in the central leader. But to address that, there's a lot of material right here that's kind of competing with it. So I'm going to consider making a cut down in here to take a big chunk of this competing material out. I'd also make a cut here to reduce, remove some of this and free it up. And finally, another cut out in here to kind of reduce some of that thickness or material that's going to compete with our central leader. The next thing I'd like to address are some of the scaffolding branches. And so I'm also, this stem right here, I would suggest maybe making a cut there to reduce its size, as well as right here to kind of reduce the size of this, this green stem. And remember, we have a weak branch union right here. So by pruning way out in the tips on this limb, I'm reducing some weight as well. That doesn't reduce as much weight as pruning off some of the side limbs further down the stem. And that's simply because this is a long lever arm. And the more weight I can reduce out in the tips, the more it reduces the weight acting upon this weak branch union. Now, if I got to this point and I thought that I still had more of my pruning dose that I could use, I would maybe consider with both of these, scaffolding branch type cuts, coming back to the green arrows here and maybe even making a more drastic cut back at the trunk just to get these out of the mix. Those aren't going to be necessarily permanent stems. They're a little bit too far down low, and I'd like to just maybe get those out of the canopy. Finally, if I'm still feeling okay about being under my recommended dose, I would consider a little bit of thinning. There's just a lot kind of going on across this canopy to open it up a little bit and remove some of the duplicating and crossing limbs. All right, so up to this point, we've seen pretty normal looking trees, right? And this winter, I've done a ton of pruning workshops on young trees to kind of prep for this presentation today and get some of these photos. And inevitably, I would say there's a lot of trees that don't have that really normal tree form, where we do have kind of an upright growth habit or, very dominant central leader. And this is a great example of that. So I wanted to go over a few of those. And I think on this plant really quickly, I would just make probably these 4 cuts. And I can kind of explain the purpose of each that, this cut I really think is focused on, the central leader and freeing it up, but it's just growing down and out of the way at a weird angle. So I want to kind of remove that. In this case, I want to make a cut right there to remove this potential competitor later for our central leader. And then the other 2 cuts I feel like are just for ground clearance purposes. And I probably could say, kind of establishing scaffolding branches too, although it's pretty young in this tree's life to be really thinking about establishing those. These lower down smaller limbs that are not as big of a deal, again, I'm going to leave on the trunk just to kind of, promote trunk taper. All right, so now to move to even a different canopy form. What do we do with something like this crabapple? And it's just, some plants are, have what we call a decurrent branch structure. So they don't really have a strong central leader. They have weak apical dominance. So they don't have an apical bud up there sending auxin down and suppressing the side limbs. And in the case of a crabapple, you're going to drive yourself crazy trying to get a central leader established and to kind of readjust this canopy. So we have to adjust our pruning expectations or objectives a little bit. So really, central leader and establishing these well-spaced scaffolding limbs, I'm going to have to throw out the door in this case, because the scaffolding, the habit of the tree is such that it's open and spreading. And really, from an ornamental standpoint, I want that look with the crabapple. I like the multi-stemmed look in this kind of spreading canopy. So I would drive myself crazy trying to make scaffolding limbs, attach perfectly. So here on the right over the tree, I've put, how I would prioritize a new set of pruning objectives when I have more of a decurrent growth habit and I don't have that just strong central leader. I can't expect that out of this plant. And I'll show another example of this too next. But I'm going to replace establishing the central leader to establishing scaffolding limbs with a strong U-shaped branch attachment. And I'm going to subordinate weaker attachments with more of a V-shaped branch union. So that means I'm going to reduce their height to allow other things to grow over them and kind of keep them from becoming a giant limb off to the side or growing up through the canopy. And I'm also going to think about, like we talked about on one of the last trees, reducing the weight out in the tips on some of those weaker branch unions. So let's look at how that would play out with this crabapple. And also I'll point out this is plus 5 years post planting. This plant's been in the ground for a while, so I really think I can prune away. I don't have transplant shock to worry about. I've examined the twigs, excellent twig growth, even in a drought year last year. So the first thing to address is, addressing this kind of weaker shaped branch attachment right here. And by kind of subordinating this side limb by removing some of this material right here with the cut right there. So that's going to allow some of the rest of this canopy to kind of grow into this area and outcompete this side limb and not let it become a major portion of the canopy. My next area I would address is another weakly attached branch on this side, where I'd suggest reducing some of the weight by just kind of getting this limb cut out of the mix. That also kind of thins it out a little bit. With crabapples, they get apple scab pretty bad a lot of the time. And if I can thin out and open up that canopy a little bit, that allows its leaves to dry out a little bit better and not be as susceptible to apple scab. Finally, I've just got a bunch of arrows in there. There's a lot of duplicating and crossing limbs that I'm going to try and thin out a little bit, and also for that purpose of better airflow, less infection, less potential for infection from apple scab. And if I had a little bit, I would maybe do some minor ground clearance, but again, that spreading habit is what we want from this plant. All right, so let's take another example of your non-typical tree, and this is a river birch, well established. This is in the U of I Arboretum here on campus, and it's in excellent health, just phenomenal twig growth, doing great. But in this case, I've realigned the objectives a little bit, because we may look at this as a multi-trunk tree, as really trying to deal with maybe establishing a central leader for this stem versus there's maybe 3 major stems. I kind of count these 2 together. Here's the main stem in the middle, and these 2 kind of go together as a separate tree, if you want to think about it that way. So you would maybe focus on in this the middle stem here, taking off one of the other sides of these 2 competing leaders, and that's to get it a little bit more of a central leader dominant structure. On the 2 side limbs, then I've drawn some arrows over the competing areas of these 2 tips. And so I consider maybe reducing one or the other to favor the other and not have 2 in direct competition. And so if I take a really close look at this branch union down here between these 2, that's a pretty narrow V-shaped union, and I do have quite a bit of bark being trapped in there. And so I would really consider kind of making some pruning cuts out here to reduce the size and the pressure on this branch union by, again, here I've kind of lined up this blue arrow with the blue stem. I took my picture of the branch union from a different angle than we're looking at the whole tree, so that's a little bit confusing, but it showed the bark the best. But anyway, I would consider some drastic cuts in here to kind of reduce some of the weight out on the tips of that branch. Finally, we've got a little bit of some shade going to this evergreen so could probably use a little work on ground clearance over here. In this area, we've got a walkway where folks go up and down these steps. Probably don't want all these limbs down here. So I think about some ground clearance and trying to visually make that kind of even for the plan. And that's not so much for a structural factor as it is for just kind of visually it looks better, is more attractive. And finally, if I had something left out of my pruning dose, I would look at some of these crossing limbs. I've circled an area where there is just limb after limb coming off the trunk. So we don't have very good spacing on that. And also with these multi-stemmed trees, oftentimes they're sending limbs back across another stem and across the middle of the canopy. And I'm trying to eliminate some of that crossing with my remaining bit of pruning dose. So in conclusion, what are some of the things that we've went over today? A lot of structural problems in a tree can be cured with pruning younger in its lifetime. So when we do that, we're going to always assess tree health prior to making any pruning cuts. We don't want to prune a stress tree. Lastly, we're going to consider aspect ratio and taking pruning measures that influence a better aspect ratio with respect to branch attachments at the trunk. Avoid clumps of limbs low down on the trunk, those clusters we looked at all day today, trying to avoid that. And the last point I didn't go over earlier in this talk, but your pruning cycle and the timing of that may help to determine this pruning dose you give. And I'm speaking to you there as a commercial arborist or a residential arborist. There's a lot of times that I was at a client's house and I didn't know when I would even be back to prune this tree again. My hope was in 3 to 5 years, we would address this again. So I'd have a good pruning cycle of usually 3 to 5 years, usually is a pretty good one to get set up on. But in the case where I know I'm not going to be back for a long time, you may need to make have a little heavier of a pruning dose to have a bigger impact today so it's more lasting. Whereas a tree in my yard, I can do tiny bits of pruning every year to adjust it over its lifetime. And so I maybe take smaller cuts and fewer if I can prune more often and kind of help that tree along better. Jamie mentioned this at the start, but if you're interested in any of the other parts of our 4-season gardening series, we have all these recordings, including this one will be posted eventually on our website there. Go check it out. And also we have, if you'd like to give us some feedback for today's pruning session, I would love to hear anything and everything you all would share. So if you scan this QR code, you can, or you can enter our go.illinois.edu/pruning2026 to get to our survey. We really do take this information to heart. So please provide us some input. Always looking to get better and improve things. And lastly, I'll go to my contact information on this slide here. If you've got a question, shoot me an email. I answer pruning questions around the state all the time. So always happy to talk pruning with folks over email. Reach out if you have a question.